What if building leadership and connection skills in real life was less about grand epiphanies and more about small, consistent reps? The way athletes train, the way musicians practice, the way simulation refines teaming and clinical performance. Push ups, sit ups, building up your cardio. We put challenges and weights in front of ourselves to get fit. We embrace no pain, no gain. Yet when we find something difficult in real life, especially an interpersonal something, we often skitter away. We put down the weight and walk away from the workout. Curious Now helps us lean into those everyday interactions, the awkward silences, simmering tensions, and high stakes conversations, and treat them like reps in a leadership gym. Curious Now, stronger later.
Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. This week we'll be reflecting on the workout of the week from episode 6, Surviving Psychological Contract Breaches. What's that like? And I'm joined by BJ So from Sydney and Mel Barlow from Brisbane, both in Australia. And I'd love to invite you to introduce yourselves. BJ.
Hi, my name is BJ So. I'm an anesthetist or anesthesiologist for our international listeners. I work primarily in Wollongong, but also up in Sydney. And my role in SIM is as the SIM lead for my department. My learner group, I suppose, would be anesthetic registrars and also registrars and trainees from other specialties when we do interdisciplinary SIM, as well as the anesthetic and recovery nurses that are based in my local area. I am not Australian, but I do live here in Australia. I'm actually Canadian, and that's where the accent comes from.
And BJ, one other thing I was interested in is you've started a community of practice recently called SimLab. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So in New South Wales, that's the state of New South Wales in Australia, we're often quite siloed as individual sim centers and sim teams. And there's not that much interaction between us, despite us having this huge wealth of knowledge and experience amongst us. So I started a small community of practice of sim educators where we meet every 2 months to just link up to discuss and promote peer-to-peer faculty development through our meetings. It's been a work in progress. We've had some wins, some less than wins, but the nice part is that I have a community that's willing to stick it out with me and try and build this little group together. So it's been a real encouragement.
Mel Barlow, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. My name's Mel Barlow. I'm currently the Associate Professor for Australian Catholic University, which is a national university here in Australia. We have 7 campuses, and my role ultimately is the academic lead for the specialised learning environments and simulations. So fundamentally, my learners are the academics, so I support them and professionally develop them to then embed experiential learning and facilitate experiential learning into curricula. So really fun job. I love teaching about SIM and getting people excited about it. And I am a registered nurse by trade.
Welcome, Mel. Wonderful to spend time with you again. And folks, you may hear the voice of our esteemed producer, James Lipshaw, from time to time. Hey, James.
What's up, Jenny?
So, Mel and BJ, just refreshing, what is the idea of the workout of the week? I feel that the values and practices of simulation, trying things, redoing when we don't do it well, reflecting on what are our thought processes, what are our feelings, sustaining the ones that are really working for us, making little tweaks and changes for the ones that aren't, is something that is so powerful in our managerial practice, our personal leadership practice, how we do things in the everyday in meetings or rounds or executive strategy discussions. And so the workout of the week idea was, how can we bring that spirit into our everyday challenges? This week, we'll be focusing on surviving psychological contract breaches. And as a refresher, the psychological contract is usually an invisible set of expectations between us that I expect you to do X and you expect me to do Y, but we actually don't even know that until I don't do what you expect or vice versa. And so we usually become aware of them in a kind of spicy, difficult moment. Anyway, I'm wondering what it was like for you this week, trying to notice if you had any psychological contract breaches. Let's talk about that. And then also later, I'd like to pivot and talk about any successes you've had with that now or in the past, or stuck points. How was that for you?
Yeah, Jenny. I guess the one that stood out for me, it's probably a bit spicy, but this was from a leadership perspective. So, in a previous role, I was having a conversation with my manager at the time. This was before like working from home was a thing, right? And I had some family stuff going on, and I wanted to have the conversation about potentially working from home. And my manager at the time said, look, just pause this conversation. We're heading into a team meeting. That's a good conversation for the team to have. Can you bring it up? Sure. And so we went into the team meeting and I brought up the topic. And then my manager just all of a sudden started having a go at me saying, why would I bring that up? Like, no one else can work from home. Basically saying I was, selfish and not a team player. And it just, I was just in the moment speechless, not only because it was just a 180 from the previous conversation we had, but that the rest of my peers sat there and didn't say anything in that moment either. And so I felt that that was an extreme example because it was almost an intentional breach, but it really got me reflecting why it had such an impact on me. And I think it's because subconsciously I'm quite a trusting person. I go in with these psychological contracts in my mind already in place without those conversations or without that explicitness of building these contracts together with the other person. And so when that person doesn't live up to that expectation that I've already built up, that's when I feel disappointed or the contract has been breached. And so there's an element of intentionality on the other person in this instance, but also reflecting on myself that I had already created this contract in my head that may not have been in place in the first place.
Thank you for sharing that, Mel. That's very poignant. It plays into such interesting challenges in terms of social cognition. I think it's a very reasonable assumption to make that if somebody says, why don't you bring this up in the next meeting, that their intention would be to support you in bringing it up, and that it would be a generative conversation around how do we make this work for the team. And it would be a surprise, as it was for you, that maybe their intention was something else we don't know. And the important thing about psychological contracts is you assumed that then she owed you support in the meeting. And she may have assumed she owed you something else in the meeting. I'm not justifying it either way. Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds like ouch.
Yes. Yeah, but it was great learning for me. And it has impacted in how I approach situations and how I support the academics today. So for me personally, in my growth, a good situation, but I wouldn't want it repeated.
So Mel, in the spirit of workout of the week, you did this workout a long time ago. You built some muscles as a result of it, or some insights as a result of it. And you've just said it's changed how I approach certain situations.
Mhm.
So what has been the growth from that workout?
The big thing that it has influenced is how I approach and how I teach pre-briefing and that psychological contract with the learners. And so particularly in higher education and particularly with our first year learners, there's a lot of anxiety coming in from school in particular. Now they're in university and now we're putting them in simulation. And usually with our first year learners, right, like they'll actually read the information you give them. And so pre-briefing is not just the bit you say before they head into the sim. In higher education, the briefing is what's in the unit outline, what's on the learning management system, what you say in the tutorial before the simulation. Um, and, there are these unintentional inconsistencies as curricula evolves that you may forget to update a piece of information. And so what you say before they head into the sim, if it's incongruent with what they've read, their level of anxiety goes up. And if that is a consistent, I think, occurrence, then that erodes trust and it erodes engagement. And so I work really hard with the academics to try and think about the consistency in messaging for our learners.
Yeah, Mel. So I think that walking our talk, whether it's a learner pre-briefing or I'm supporting you, my mentee or my direct report or my boss in the following way, and then supporting them in that is really important, that consistency. What I thought you were going to say, and maybe this is just where my inference went, is if I had had your experience, I think one of the things that I would do, and I just learned this from you, Mel, is, hey, you've said bring this up in the meeting coming up. I assume you're saying that because we will have a conversation in which you're going to support the idea to some degree, and we will discuss how we might be able to make it work. But what is your thought about what we will discuss in the meeting? And, that's where we can quash the thing I mentioned earlier, which is that false consensus effect, which is, I'm assuming you're thinking about this the same way I am. So thank you so much for highlighting the shoals in the psychological contract conversations.
Jenny, actually, to that point, you're absolutely right. I think I am, as a result of that, a lot more explicit in, I guess, signposting when I go into conversations outside of SIM with my manager, with my peers, around outcomes for the conversation. And, if I seek feedback, like what type of feedback, more explicitly. So I think it has really influenced being clearer and transparent, more transparent with my thinking to save, I guess, a little bit of pain at the other end.
So BJ, you've been listening, but also very interested in your experience around noticing yourself saying that's not fair, or I thought this, or, how has that psychological contract journey played out for you?
I'd like to just reflect a second on what Mel said there, because it's made me think about, I guess, the power imbalance that can occur when this psychological contract breach occurs. My scenario, or my situation, which I'll share in a moment, involves me being the one with power, setting the contract in a suboptimal way, leading to harm for the person I was interacting with. Whereas in Mel's situation, she was the receiver. And I feel like a lot of the power in that dynamic, when this breach happens, how would the receiver end respond using what we've just discussed now? And that move you said there, Jenny, about trying to make more explicit. Just to be clear, we're going to this meeting in a second, and the reason why you want to bring it up in the group is because I'm thinking you want me to share it with others and gather their input. Maybe that's trying to assume the better angle, but at least you're making explicit what their intentions are. Because it is more challenging when you're on that end, I think, to speak up. Whereas on the giving end, which is, I think, where a lot
Yeah,
of Mel's
absolutely.
reflections went, it's you have so much more power and responsibility to try and set that safe standard for both parties.
Absolutely. And BJ, one thing I'll layer in based on your comment is I'm hearing the voice of my longtime friend, Kathy Baker, who's a law professor at Chicago Kent College of Law and teaches contracts. And I talk to her about this subject from time to time, and she always reminds me, Jenny, a contract is not a contract unless it has agreements on both sides or commitments on both sides. And so that's why psychological contracts are so sneaky, because Mel signed on to the contract of going into the meeting with hidden, unstated assumptions about what was her side of the contract, and unstated assumptions about the contract she signed, which was, you're going to bring this up in a supportive way. We're going to work this out together. And that's why it's such an unusual contract, because it's not written down on paper and you can't see what you're signing up for. You don't know that it existed or failed or succeeded until usually it fails. So it's especially tricky.
Listening to the workout of the week made me reflect again on a historical event, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, where I was. So this is working in an anesthetic context. For those of you who may not, for the listeners here who may not be as familiar with what we do in anesthetics, often in this setup we have one consultant, in this case myself, and one trainee working together to see a case through an operation. So it's quite a close relationship we have with our learner groups. In this instance, I was working with quite a junior anesthetic registrar and wanting to promote more independent practice. We did something which I think the literature has described as negotiated autonomy. So, hey, registrar, how about you run this case and I'll sit back here and supervise. I'll let you make all the decisions. If anything happens that seems untoward, I'll jump in and give you a hand. Are you okay with that? And I'd done this by this stage many times with other trainees, and it worked fine, and after had a positive reception. Well, in this instance, the registrar, let me tell you what happened, and then I'll give you my reflections on what might have been the undercurrent of what was going on. The registrar says, sure, yep. The reg then does an anesthetic style that I'm aware of. I've done a few times, but it's not my go-to approach for how I'd anesthetize this particular patient. The registrar does it, and something untoward happens with this patient. Nothing critical, but enough that I have to get up and intervene. And essentially, because this is a technique that I don't normally use, I pushed that to the side and instituted my own technique, brought the patient back. Everything was fine. The case ended very uneventfully. Now, the reception from the registrar was, I think, oh my gosh, I just failed, coupled with, you just set me up to fail. And the amazing, beautiful discussion of this debrief of the moment that was supposed to happen didn't, because the registrar felt, I think, very threatened by what I just exposed that person to. So I think on reflection of that now, where did we go wrong? How come this often works better in other contexts, but in this instance, it didn't? I think I hadn't quite explicitly, clearly explored the registrar's level of competence and confidence, nor had I explicitly stated me stepping in is likely to happen in this instance, like to signpost that. FYI, you're doing a technique that I wouldn't normally use. It could work amazing, or it might fall apart. But if it does fall apart, don't be worried because I'm here and I will do this. And because that lack of signposting and explicit setting the terms of our engagement, things seem to fall apart and not in a good way. And one that had to spend the rest of the session digging myself out of to rebuild that breach in our contract.
What's so interesting about that story, BJ, is its multi-layered quality, or at least two-layered quality, which is some non-shared expectations around the management of the patient, and then conclusions that the resident slash registrar drew about your intentions, by if they thought you kind of set them up. So what I'd like to do is kind of move toward some guidance for ourselves that we might invent together based on what we have talked about. In both cases, I think there were hidden aspects of what we thought we owed each other in the contract. That's Denise Rousseau's language, what we owe each other, and or what are our expectations, that led to not only problems in the moment, but impacts on the relationship, which is what I think is the most important or high impact part of psychological contracts. Wondering what goes through your guys' minds as, super reflective creators of your own paths. You lifted these weights, you got a bit stronger, but how?
Well, when I just listened to BJ, it was just what really resonated for me was the power of the preview, right? And so,
Yeah.
like, there's so much power in that of just explicitly and upfront say, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I want to talk about, this is how we want to work together, and having that conversation up front. that, it may come across initially strong or unexpected to the other person, but I think knowing what we know, the outcome at the other end of not having that preview, we know the world of pain that we're saving not only ourselves from, but the other person from, and we're maintaining the relationship. So for me, yeah, the power of the preview and is what really resonated with me.
I think a line I've often heard said in sim circles, which I think applies to this too, is making the implicit explicit.
Mm.
And so rather than assuming we know what we're each going to be talking about, let's just say it out loud so we're both crystal clear as to what might happen. And doing that, particularly in the preview context, I think is when it's most effective rather than post-event, which is where we often fall down.
Somebody might listen to this or be thinking, hey, it's always good in manager direct report relationships or manager boss conversations or educator learner conversations to make our expectations explicit. So what's different? And to me, I think what's different is it dials up recognition that there's unexpected and unstated contract between us, dials up the importance essentially of trying to predict, if I can use a clinical word, what are the complications that might happen if we don't see down the track. So I really thank you both for those wonderful stories. And I'm interested to hear, as we touch base in the future, how you continue to survive psychological contract breaches and/or head them off before they happen. So thank you very much, Mel Barlow and BJ So, for joining us to discuss your workout of the week regarding psychological contracts.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Jenny.